The day trading Visual Basics system has three powers within it: the indicator power, the formula power, and the procedures power. The indicator power is the 22 market force recognition indicators, and they form the patterns and the conditions and the signals that we get to utilize the formula that of finding a pattern, verifying the conditions, and using signals or waiting for the signal to enter or exit the trade. This video is about the types of conditions there are within the system. Briefly, I've used this example before, but basically if you take 10 patterns and 2 of them end up in 2 big green candles, and 5 or 6 end up in small candles, small green candles, and 2 or 3 end up in small red candles, we obviously would like to find those patterns that end up with nice big green candles. And so we have determined that there are specific conditions within individual patterns that will give us or typically give us strong green candles the next day in the case of pattern types up. You know, there's 23 pattern types up and 23 pattern types down. And so there's different conditions that would be there to qualify them as good conditions within those different patterns, obviously. So the basic formula of the finding a pattern, locating the condition, and picking the time to enter the trade is what the formula is all about. The good conditions can start off with something, or we always look at the 7 short-term trend lines. Those are the 3 groups that have been created for identifying short-term trend, or the current trend, you might say. The trend trio, yellow, pink, blue, is the first group, and orange and green is the second group, power orange and green, and swing red and green are the third group. We tried to create one line like we did with the master long-term trend line, and that is basically an exponential average line, but we just left too much information out if we tried to shove everything into one line. So we have created 3 groups of lines, or 7 short-term trend lines, that give us a lot more information on the current trend than one line would have done if we chose to do it that way. And when those 7 lines are going up, and for example you have a red spike, which is zip red down under 50 and zip yellow down above 50, the next day is up. You're going to get a stronger candle when those 7 lines are going up, or when those 7 lines are above 0, than you would if those candles are going down if those 7 short-term trend lines are going down or they're under 0. Now, there's obviously other types of conditions that we would define as good conditions. Types of conditions are basically required conditions and good conditions and extra conditions, which we call supporting evidence. The required conditions are like when I just described a red spike. That red spike is a named pattern. It has a name to it. There are shape patterns as well, like BOC patterns, TOC, top of cycle patterns, right leg W patterns or high M patterns, bottlenose patterns. Besides the different patterns that we have those conditions that fall within those specific patterns. The red spike has zip red going down and under 50. The condition that zip red is going down is a required condition defining the pattern or describing the pattern. A red peak is zip red going up above 50 and zip yellow going up and under 50. The up or the directional up movement is the defining or requirement or required condition to the pattern to qualify it or to qualify it as that named pattern. So you have required conditions, and they're basically neutral in nature because they're defining the pattern oftentimes. Good conditions fall within poor, bad, and good, and we obviously want the good conditions like those two big green candles we talked about earlier in that example. But what happens when we pick those two green candles, we pick the evidence, we pick the conditions, and we call them the good conditions of the pattern. And many conditions repeat themselves in different up patterns, and many conditions repeat themselves in different down patterns, pattern types down. The end result is that when we have, let me back up. When we have two patterns out of 10 that have nice big green candles, we basically have a 20% high probability ratio that we're going to get a nice green candle if we should buy that pattern next day. That's not high probability, obviously. 20% isn't. But when you take the good conditions that support that pattern to get those results, we then are taking 100% of the good conditions. And so when I say the high probability ratios are above 90%, often above 95% in direction and volatility, and obviously you can get candles that have big tall green candle bodies. Sometimes you can see you can anticipate what you're going to get, and you end up with a small green candle that had a big upper tail. So in other words, we could have closed or sold out on that at the top of the pattern when the candle body was way at the top. Now, those good patterns that we identify with basically create a situation in which when we look at a pattern and when we pick the good conditions with that pattern, we are picking an opportunity that has a real high probability of going in that direction and being strong. We don't know that it's going to stay strong for the whole day because it could drop down and have that high upper tail like I just described. But when you think about it, what you have here is only trades with high probability opportunities. And that's something that most systems do not have. And so when we talk about patterns with good conditions, that's exactly what we're talking about. The third type of patterns is primarily in gap analysis, and we refer to it as extra or supporting evidence. And briefly, as brief as I can be here, the the three patterns, the three gap patterns that make up gaps up are identical indicators and down touches in the trend chart and location and shape patterns in the proximity groups within the power chart. The power 4 is the pink, blue, white, and yellow. If you take the yellow out, you have the power 3. If you add power Zion, you have the power 5. In a gap up, the power 4 can be above the power orange line, and power Zion can be under the power orange line, and that's divergent. Zion is divergent to the power 4, and so we think, and as a result, we often get stronger gaps when the power 4 and the power Zion are divergent to each other, meaning Zion under power orange and power 4 above power orange. They also have shapes. They can be in BOC patterns or right leg W patterns, or like I talked about, like other patterns that I've talked about previously. The three patterns, the identical indicators, to qualify for a gap up, you need 12 out of the 22 market force recognition indicators, MFR indicators, that are in an identical pattern. They're all in a BOC pattern. They're all in some type of shape pattern. You can also have something like 9 BOC patterns and 6 right leg W higher patterns. That's a 2-pattern group with 15 total indicators, and that qualifies because it's more than 12. Now you can get, I have seen gaps that are identical indicators that fall a little short of the 12 minimum, but we like to see 12 most of the time. And so when you get the identical indicator count, when you get the down touch, and then keep in mind there's 6 down touches that qualify in both the gaps up and the gaps down, and then you have the proximity group location and the proximity group shape patterns that we like to see in what I'll refer to is in their normal position. Unlike the requirements that we have for the identical indicators and the down touches in gaps up or up touches in gaps down, the location patterns and shape patterns in the proximity group are not technically a requirement. You think of it like they're normally, like a particular pattern would normally have the power 4 and power Zion in 2 or 3 locations that would cause a gap up most of the time. But they can appear in different positions, and the shapes can be in different positions as well. But typically, when you do your gap analysis, and you especially if you put it together on something like an Excel spreadsheet, you're going to find that there are oftentimes 2 or 3 different shapes that correspond with a particular pattern, and 2 or 3 different locations that correspond to a different pattern. But they're not technically a requirement. Like you have to have a down touch, one of the 6 qualifying down touches, in order to get a gap next day. Now, you can get a gap next day. It's typically going to be small if you don't have any other information there. And that other information is referred to as extra information or supporting evidence. And so the three types of conditions are the required conditions and the poor, bad, or good conditions, and the extra or supporting evidence conditions. Example, in the identical indicators, I talked about 9 BOC patterns and 6 right leg W patterns. The other patterns that would appear are something like zip Zion highest or zip Zion lowest, zip green at 100 or zip green at 0. A red spike, for example, zip red down under 50, zip yellow down above 50. Those are additional information. Those are supporting evidence, and the more supporting evidence that you get with your qualifying 3-gap patterns, you have to have the identical indicators, you have to have the down touches, and you like to see the proximity group in certain locations and shapes. When you have that and you get supporting evidence like swing pink is a leading indicator, it's going up, or another pattern like the red spike that I talked about, or the zip Zion highest. You'll see many gap patterns occur when zip Zion is highest. When you get another pattern that goes along with the 3 gap patterns that are now qualified for a gap, then you get bigger gaps or stronger movements. Keep in mind, you can have all that information that I just described, and next day you can get a monster green candle. It does not gap, but by the end of the day, it looks just like a gap, or something along those lines. Sometimes you can get a 2-day really big green candles, and you thought you were going to get a gap. So the evidence is there. The gap always may not occur. There's also what I refer to as a stalled day. In other words, you see the information and the next day you get a tiny green candle. You might even get a tiny red candle. But the following day is when the gap or the big movement takes place. That happens often, or let me say this, it happens more often when you're dealing with divergence. Because divergence is a thing that a large majority of the time the reaction occurs next day, but sometimes it'll happen on day 2 or even day 3. We don't deal with anything past day 3 with any kind of substantive verification. So even though I'm referring this information as supporting evidence, it's basically conditions, or what you might say good conditions. And so these are the 3 types of good conditions, these are the 3 types of conditions that we have. We typically think of good conditions when you're thinking of a next day up or an uptrend, because it doesn't have the qualifications of the 3-gap pattern group. And we normally think of supporting evidence as we tie it to gap analysis. But you can think of supporting evidence in uptrends and next day ups as well. That supporting evidence is real evident. That supporting evidence, I'm going to switch over here to an example of what I've got for supporting evidence. And if you look here, you've got what I've done is I've basically got a list of items that are typical with in supporting evidence. And this particular list here is just for gaps up, and there's 27 items that you can see. Obviously, you're in certain patterns, you're going to have certain ones or certain of those types of supporting evidence with those particular patterns, generally speaking, or typical of that specific pattern. Underneath this is another list of 27, and this is for gaps down. Now, I share this with you because it's basically identical to good conditions. And so when you're looking for good conditions, here's a list to look at. And you can print this off and identify and have it on your desktop and be able to review it and identify with what items are making up your good conditions. In that list too, that I did not include are the 7 short-term trend lines, because when I created the list, it was basically I was thinking of gaps. And also it's marked as partial. I mean, there's others that I've thought of after I made this list, and you can, as you watch videos, you can listen to the comments that I make about, well, this line is highest or this line is up. And when I say those things, it's basically a good condition for the specific pattern in question, or it's a type of supporting evidence for that pattern as well. Excuse me. So those are what we refer to as the 3 types of conditions, and I wanted to make sure, because I was just going to do one video on the types of conditions, and I wanted to encompass everything that there was about those conditions. So this has gotten longer than I wanted it to, but I really feel it's important to cover the subject as best we possibly can. Have fun trading. I'm grateful that you're here watching the videos. I really encourage you to consider the system that you're using, because I often ask the question, what's more important, the next trade that you make or the system that you use to find the next trade that you make? And obviously it's the system. And DTVB has just got a lot of extras in it. From the 3 powers within the system. It's just like, back in 2007, more than 10 years ago, I made a trade, the very first trade I ever made in buying stocks. And a few weeks later, I had a couple of indicators created. And I thought I had a better system. But I was my plan of trading, and then I was going to find a system. I was going to enhance a method or do something, and that I'd then have a system. And for years, all I did was create more indicators. I did not have a system. And it was not until we discovered the patterns with the conditions, and then shortly thereafter, we immediately identified signals that we could relate with to identify timing on that pattern, and so that when the formula came about, then we had a system, and that's the exciting part of day trading Visual Basics. We've got a system, and it's powerful. So compare it to what you have. I think if you have a chance to watch the videos, I really encourage you to watch a lot of videos, spend some time on here. It might take you a month or even 2 months. It doesn't make any difference. Learn the system, then go to the website. There's a free 14-day trial. And after the 14-day trial, you can make a decision about whether you want to utilize this system. And we hope you will. We firmly believe that with the indicators, because it's just like this. If you take the default indicators that TradeStation has, you are going to probably, I don't know, I have no idea exactly what the ratio is, but I'm guessing it's something like, in that 25% area. You might find divergence 20, maybe it's only 10%. I have no idea. You're not going to find divergence nowhere near the number of times that you'll find it with sensitive indicators. They just recognize tiny market force changes or market pressure movements, and that identifies lines to move, and when you have pairs in divergence, one force tells you that things are going up, and another force tells you that things are going down. When that happens, you're going to get a reaction, and that's one reason also why divergence can be delayed into the second or the third day. But it's a powerful system. We were truly amazed at the things that we saw a few years ago, and have built in and created new stuff continually now. The best, go to the radar screen and look up the master radar screen lists. We have the down touches and the up touches, the 6 required, or the 6 qualifying down touches and the 6 qualifying up touches. We have about a dozen different types of divergence on the master divergence chart. You can put those on. You can put 200 or 300 indicators on in the radar screen, and you can find out which ones have the divergence, and it's so much quicker. You have to look at lines and see if one leg is higher than the other leg, and sometimes you have to go to the data window to make sure one is higher and one is lower. But with the radar screen information, it electronically spits it right out into a box color alert. That is fast. And that's when we knew we could do this, we took the time to build those. And we have now 8 master radar screens that are helpful for any type of strength movement, any type of next day or uptrend or downtrend movement, multi-day movement, and obviously with gaps. So there's just a lot of power that is built in and ready to go when you start with this system.